All right, so I want to review. We are dealing with evolution and what evolution teaches, proponents and mechanisms of evolution. Then starting on Monday, I'm going to start attacking it, and we're going to talk about 6 evidences that are used to substantiate gradualism. And we will start actually getting into a little more science then. So let's review. Let's review what is evolution. As I said and asked on the quiz, the evolutionary paradigm and the creation paradigm are actually more alike than they are different. They are both doctrines. So the evolutionary paradigm is just as religious as the creation paradigm. What is a paradigm? Remember, it's a basic assumption from which you reason and interpret. It's kind of similar to a worldview, but it's a paradigm is how you interpret data. It's the framework of interpretation that you use. Okay, so the doctrine of creation. Everything in the physical universe has gradually, over billions of years, developed into its present state. So which view of evolution is that? We have 2. The main view of evolution, which is gradualism. So this is actually gradualism, isn't it? Or Darwinism. And then we have the alternate view, which is punctuated equilibrium, Niles Eldredge and Stephen Gould. Okay? Those are overall views. But we are going to attack and deal with gradualism, which is, in general, when we use the word evolution, we are referring to gradualism. And in general, when we use the word evolution, we are referring to organic evolution. Okay? And so, when we are talking about evolution and we start talking about evidences used to promote evolution, I will use evolution as synonymous with gradualism. Okay? And that's why I want you to know the 3 steps of gradualism. The first is variation by what? Random mutation, followed by natural selection, choosing the correct or the best genes to survive, also called survival of the fittest, and then accumulation of small changes. Another thing I want you to remember is the overall essence of gradualism, and we'll take Charles Darwin's words right out of his book, is numerous, successive, slight, what? Modifications. You're going to see that again. And remember, Charles Darwin had no idea of genetics. That's why he used the word modifications. He did not use the word mutation. Why not? Didn't know about it. Okay? And in a sense, we can kind of excuse Charles Darwin. He lived in the 1800s. He didn't know about genetics. He didn't know how mutations occur and what mutations actually do. He didn't know the details of how this could have happened. So that's the other thing I want you to understand with evolution. It's a paradigm, but it's also very religious. It is a doctrine, okay? And it has tenets. You need to know the tenets and figure out how they fit into what we're talking about. The first tenet has to do with that there are no supernatural processes. And a lot of this is understanding, not just listing. As I mentioned, I'm going to give you true and false questions because I want to see if you're understanding and putting 2 and 2 together and not just memorizing definitions and memorizing doctrines and tenets. Okay, so this first tenet is something you need to know so that you will recognize it as evolution, okay? And in fact, as gradualism. So everything came about by natural processes. There is no supernatural, okay? And of course, then this is the mechanism, natural processes. Evolution and the, I guess it's a worldview of naturalism, go hand in hand. Then tenet number 2 is another thing. Foundational to evolution is that these are random mutations. So we're dealing with chance. Okay, chance mutations, And that's why we have to have all these millions of years in order to get a good gene combination. So that's the mode of evolution, chance. Then tenet 3, what's the result of evolution? Higher and higher levels of order and complexity. So we're always looking for a simple to complex progression. Tenet number 4, of course, is the requirement of evolution. Millions and millions of years. Why do we need millions and millions of years? Because we have to have these chance combinations occurring. So it takes a lot of time and a lot of trial and error, so we need millions and millions of years. Okay, so evolution is a paradigm when we try to put it in the realm of science. And evolution and creation alike are both, at best, historical sciences. They don't fit operational science, which is why I don't like to call it the evolutionary what? Theory, okay? Or the theory of evolution. And the other thing I want you to understand is the common use of the word evolution today means descent with modification. We will be talking about the intelligent design movement. And there are some intelligent design proponents that have very good arguments, which we're going to borrow and use and expand. But several of them are still evolutionists because they think that we somehow descended. Now, they disagree with the mechanism of gradualism, okay? But they are still evolutionists. They still go back to tenet number 1, no God. So there have to be some natural processes. It just wasn't gradualism. It just wasn't Darwin. Darwin was wrong. Okay, so all of these things you need to start thinking them through and putting them together so that you can understand what we're talking about. So evolution originally just means what? A gradual change. The root word is unrolling as of a scroll. But in common usage today, evolution means descent with modification. And even your intelligent design proponents still might agree with that part. In particular, I'm thinking of Michael Behe. He is a biochemistry professor out of Pennsylvania. He is a big intelligent design proponent. He wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. But he is still an evolutionist, and he still believes that we descended gradually over time. Definitely not a creationist. So these things are important for you to start understanding and putting together. All right, so we're going to talk today in detail about the evolution story, okay? And of course, the evolutionary story begins with the Big Bang. And I'm kind of being facetious and a little sarcastic here, but it's very much a story, okay? So maybe we should start today's lecture with what? Once upon a time. In reality, some of the ideas here are just as ridiculous. And I asked you on the quiz today about Charles Darwin. Who was Charles Darwin? First thing that should come to your mind is he was a British naturalist who lived in the 1800s. He's also sometimes called the icon of evolution. After all, gradualism is basically called what? Darwinism. But what I want you to think about with Charles Darwin is that he's called the icon of evolution because he put a cloak of science over evolution in that he came up with some way that he could start explaining how it could have occurred. And he called that mechanism what? What's he famous for? Natural selection. So I want you to understand about Charles Darwin. Yes, it's nice that you might know some things about his life, but that's not as important as understanding who he was and how he contributed to evolutionary thinking, okay? And he is significant. That's why we call it Darwinism, even though it's been certainly updated since 1850. And he's very famous for The Origin of Species, even though that book did not cover the origin of species. But that book was about descent with modification. So when you hear the word evolution, I want you to equate it with the idea descent with modification, okay? And I want you to understand that Charles Darwin was one of the first to come up with something that sounded very scientific. And he came up with something that he could illustrate in nature. Remember, he dabbled in all kinds of things. That was kind of a hobby for him, collecting beetles, classifying things, and then he was able to go on the HMS Beagle. Okay, but remember, he was able to illustrate natural selection with pigeon husbandry. Now that kind of doesn't parallel evolution. There's two reasons why animal husbandry doesn't parallel evolution. Number one, they're still just pigeons, right? So are we progressing to a new kind? No. And number two, pigeon husbandry is directed by a person. That's the intelligent design argument, okay? So he was able to illustrate evolution with things that are occurring, but what do we call that? We call that microevolution. That is adaptation to environment, and in particular, animal husbandry, directing animal reproduction to get the traits that you want. How does that correlate with evolution? It doesn't, does it? Because it's being directed by human intelligence. And evolution is not supposed to be directed by intelligence. It's supposed to be random, natural processes. Okay, so a lot of these things are important for you to start understanding and putting together. So I am going to be a little tongue-in-cheek, and we're going to call this the evolutionary story. And I'm really tempted to say once upon a time. So the origin of the universe, remember, cosmic evolution is an attempt to explain the origin of the universe, and the leading theory now is still the Big Bang. Though there are many scientists and mathematicians in particular that have problems with this theory, I'm not going to talk about it. But the Big Bang is just what it says it is, that all matter was, I'm using the word created, but somehow it came together, collapsed in this single point, all the matter, and then it exploded into existence. That is the first step of cosmic evolution, is the Big Bang, which answers the question, where did matter come from? Well, it came from the Big Bang. Then the second step in our cosmic evolution, I'm calling stellar communities. This is the origin of stars. So the stars are going to be formed by matter, first of all, that was exploded out by the Big Bang, and then the matter coalesced into stars. Okay, so we have the communities of stars being formed gradually. Notice the time. I don't know what happened to the PowerPoint there. Got black underline, white underline. Anyways, the time. The age of the universe in the evolutionary story is anywhere from 15 to 20 billion years ago. Then the last step in our origin of universe, in our cosmic evolution, is the stellar collapse, 4.6 billion years. Does anybody recognize that date? That's the supposed age of the Earth. So we have the formation of the planets. When, stars burn out, correct? We can observe that. Stars are burning out and so on. And that, of course, would be the origin of the planets, when we have stars collapsing and exploding and sending matter into outer space. So the planets were formed by collapsing stars. So there's, not organic, that's cosmic evolution. It explains the origin of the universe. Initially with the Big Bang, 15 to 20 billion years ago, then the formation of the stars, then the formation of the planets. Planet Earth about 4.6 billion. Yes?
What do they have reasons they say why there was a Big Bang?
Yes, and they have it worked out mathematically, the fact of the universe expanding and so forth. And they also use, for evidence, they use some of the electromagnetic wavelengths. It's called a redshift. So they do try to substantiate it. Yes?
If they say that the sun is burning out and the Earth
is
spins, well, wouldn't that technically mean that the rate that it's slowing down, it should already be burnt out?
Exactly, and that's a big problem too. This is observable science in that we can measure the collapse of the sun. So if you extrapolate backwards, the sun would have to be much, much larger than it is. And so that is a problem. Okay, and so we will talk about this when we're doing geology in the next section about why we should be young Earth creationists, and that's part of the problem. So there's a lot of problems with this, and the technique is to ignore the problem and to attack people who believe in creation. So that is a problem. I want to spend most of our time dealing with organic evolution. We will deal a little bit with the cosmic evolution. We're dealing with the age of the Earth in the next section. All right, so the origin of life. I got this particular term from the Chicago Tribune. There was an article that had the evolutionary story all spelled out and pictures and so forth. And the author of this, the journalist who authored this article, called it biochemical roulette. So I'm using that. I like that. Biochemical roulette. So what is the origin of life according to the Bible? God created it. He brought it into existence. What is the origin of life according to evolution? Biochemical roulette in the primordial soup. How many have ever heard of the primordial soup? I'm going to call it the biochemical roulette. This is kind of like Russian roulette, right? Spin it, see what happens. Spin it, see what happens. Okay. And the idea here is that we had to have, before we could have life, we had to have the first biomolecules. Biomolecules include proteins, DNA and RNA, which are nucleic acids, and lipids and carbohydrates, very large molecules that are a big part of what life is made out of and how life functions. In particular, we would have had the amino acids would have to be formed first. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Then we have a little problem. If amino acids came first and proteins came first, does anybody know how proteins are formed today in the cells? It's called transcription, then translation for protein synthesis. What drives protein synthesis? What are genes made out of that drives all of your characteristics? Down to the molecular level, your genes determine what proteins are made. What biomolecule are genes? They're nucleic acids. Are they proteins? No. So if proteins came first, how were they formed without DNA to direct them? So we've got the cart, the horse, before the cart. So there's all kinds of problems with this. So the biochemical roulette gives us the first biomolecules leading to the first life. So biochemical roulette, this is the chemistry explanation, trying to figure out how did life begin. Well, we have to have biomolecules first, and so these biomolecules, the first amino acids, would have formed by random molecular collisions in the primordial soup. So with biochemical roulette, I like the term because that implies what? That life began by chance. Okay? And these chance, the idea of chance here is that we had to have millions and millions and millions of chance collisions of the right atoms in the right amounts to get your first biomolecules, which are proteins. All right, and this occurred in the primordial soup. So here we are, the origin of life according to evolution. Here are the ideal conditions on the Earth. What do you see? Volcanic activity. You see the meteors coming in from outer space. Do you see the primeval moon right there? So somehow we got the ideal conditions on the Earth in the so-called primordial soup. And somehow, over millions of years of chance molecular collisions, we get the first biomolecules. Okay, so there's the Earth in its primordial state. All right, so the origin of life involves, first of all, biochemical roulette, which means it's entirely up to chance. We have random molecular collisions in the primordial soup, and eventually we got biomolecules, but there's kind of a big jump between biomolecules like proteins and a living cell, don't you think? So this is a big problem for evolutionists. When did we get the first cells? Does somebody have a credible mechanism? Well, Richard Dawkins was asked this on more than one occasion in taped interviews, and he just gets all upset and tells us how science has proven it. Well, proven what? How did it happen? Give me the details. It's a problem. Then the next stage in the origin of life is safety in numbers. Okay, safety in numbers. Once we finally somehow get our first cells, we have to have the proteins, then we have to have the lipids, which form the cellular membranes. When we finally get the first cell, then the next thing that happens is the evolution of multicellular life. Safety in numbers, the evolution of multicellular life. Now here is where evolutionists make a big deal of the two types of cells. You've probably heard that there are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells are like bacteria. They're small and they're simpler, but actually they're very complex. Studying bacteria is complicated. It's not just this little blob of protoplasm surrounded by a plasma membrane. Cells are very, very complex. So I'm going to go back to Charles Darwin. We can excuse Charles Darwin for two reasons in particular. Obviously, he was in the 1800s. He had no idea about genetics, and he had no idea about cell biology. Cell biology is extremely complex, even when you're dealing with prokaryotic cells, bacteria. Prokaryotic cells are very small. They don't have a distinct nucleus. The other type of cell is called eukaryotic cells. These have a nucleus. And so evolutionists say, oh, we know what happened. Somehow a bigger cell ingested a little smaller cell, and that cell became the nucleus. So now we have these more complicated cells called eukaryotic cells. And then somehow they decided to start working together and becoming a multicellular organism. Well, how did that occur? I don't know. And I'm having a hard time finding out. Okay? Because a lot of evolution is completely missing evidence. So safety in numbers. So we have multicellular life about 1.8 billion years ago. And then as we continue to try to get the origin of life situated, we have an explosion of life. This is called the Cambrian explosion. I want you to notice that date. So far I want you to pay attention to dates involving the Big Bang, the origin of the universe, 15 to 20 million years ago. I also want you to notice the origin of the Earth, the stellar collapse, 4.6 billion years ago. And then as far as actual life, the real beginning of life is called the Cambrian explosion. And this is about 575 million years ago. So about 500 million, a little more than 500 million. The explosion of life, called the Cambrian explosion, this is named for the rock layers, the very bottom rock layers in the geologic column. So life exploded from multicellular life in the oceans. So life began how? Biochemical roulette gives us the first biomolecules, and somehow these molecules get together to form the first cellular life. Then somehow we get a complicated cell and multicellular life, and then we have the Cambrian explosion 575 million years ago. So the origin of the universe, 15 to 20 billion. The origin of the Earth, 4.6 billion. The origin of life, about 500 million years ago, give or take the 75 million, okay? Then, of course, this is when we start, when we're talking about the explosion of life, we're talking about millions and millions of different invertebrates all at once. And gradually then we will have to evolve into vertebrates. What are the first vertebrates? Where is this occurring? In the oceans. So your first vertebrates to develop, to evolve, are fish. So there's the explosion of invertebrate life. Now the next section I want to cover is the complexity of life. So we have the origin of the universe and the earth, and of course the stars and the sun. Then we have the origin of life, culminating in the Cambrian explosion, where we're finally starting to get vertebrate life. So the next thing that happens, as far as we're starting to get into real animal life now, is we have to have, it's called on the beach, because your complicated vertebrate animals came out of the oceans. So this is the evolution of the land animal. The first land animals would be the amphibians. There's one for you. Who knows what they might have looked like. And then, so we'd have to have somehow the evolution of limbs from fins so that we could gradually evolve from a fish to an amphibian. And then amphibians are going to change to more terrestrial animals, the reptiles. And of course there's an artist rendition of something in between reptile amphibian type ancestor. So the complexity of life, when we start really evolving well into the animal kingdom, occurs when fish somehow evolve limbs and are able to crawl out, it have to be quite literally, out of the water. Then the next thing in our story is in the complexity of life is the emergence and dominance of the dinosaur. Dinosaur, of course, means terrible lizard. What do creationists think about dinosaurs? They're just a type of very large reptile, right? That lived, well, reptiles have a thing that's called, most of them do, have a thing called indeterminate growth. What does that mean? They keep growing and growing and growing and growing. So the longer reptiles live, the what? Bigger and bigger they get. So if men were living in the book of Genesis, how many years old? 900, right? You were really died young if you only lived to 300. So you've got 900, 600-year-old human life in the book of Genesis. What would happen if a reptile lives 300 years under ideal conditions and climate? Dinosaurs are not a problem for creationists. They're just a very large type of reptile. And why don't we see dinosaurs today? Because they became extinct after the flood. Dinosaurs are a big tool for evolutionists to use, okay, because they can reel children in. Another big tool, of course, remember, why does the average person believe in evolution? Why? They were what? Indoctrinated with it. And I mean literally indoctrinated with it. How? Education, but also what? Entertainment. Okay, Jurassic Park. What did they do? They took a lot of artistic license, and so they used dinosaurs to just preach evolution. Okay? And even if you look at between the different movies, they've decided that reptiles, what did they do? They evolved into birds. So what did they put on their dinosaur? Anybody know? By the second movie. What did they put on the dinosaur? What?
Feathers.
Feathers. Why? Because they have evidence that dinosaurs started evolving feathers? No. They were propagating and preaching evolutionary doctrine. So dinosaurs are a big deal. You need to understand what you believe about dinosaurs. All right, you go to the Field Museum and you see the Tyrannosaurus rex Sioux, very famous, very nice fossil, okay? Of course, you don't get to see much of Sioux because it's casted and molded, and they're not going to display the real thing. They will cast and reproduce it, okay? You think they're going to sit it out there for people to touch? No, but dinosaurs are a big part of evolutionary indoctrination. So do you know why the dinosaurs were so large? Do you know why the dinosaurs became extinct? Because that's a big part of our evolutionary story. So dinosaur is just what its name means. It is a large, extinct reptile. So according to our evolutionary story, it ruled the world for about 100 million years, and then here it is. According to evolution, why did the dinosaurs become extinct? Well, it was about 65 million years ago, and so they have to make some reason that dinosaurs became extinct. And the prevailing story is that there was some large meteor impact. Okay? Do they have evidence of that on the Earth's surface? Well, there's some large craters, but certainly not that big. Okay? So, as we continue on the complexity of life in our evolutionary story, the extinction of the dinosaurs is followed by the rise of the mammal. So, again, can you explain dinosaurs as a creationist? Why were the dinosaurs so big? Why did they become extinct? Does that fit the creation paradigm? Of course, in the evolutionary paradigm, around 65 million years ago, there was a massive extinction. Does anybody know what caused the real massive extinction? The flood. So then the dinosaurs became extinct, and only your some type of mammal-like ancestor survives. Yes?
Do they try to explain how all the dinosaurs happen to be in that one spot?
No, because what they do is they make the meteor so large that it is a global catastrophic event. In our minds, we think, well, only animals at the impact site are going to be destroyed. Well, obviously they would be, but that would completely destroy the climate, the climatic conditions on the Earth. You'd have all this ash. Big enough meteor could possibly explain the tilt of the Earth on its axis, 23.5 degrees off the, how the Earth is tilted on its axis, which is why we have the different seasons in the different hemispheres. So we're not talking a small meteor impact, we're talking a catastrophic global event to explain the extinction of the dinosaur. Just like the flood, because the flood does that for us. It explains the extinction, the mass extinction, and it explains the catastrophic events that shaped the continents and most likely caused that 23.5 degree tilt of the Earth off its axis. Because I don't see that being perfect at creation. Why wouldn't the Earth be perpendicular in its axis? It's how it's tilted off. So I think we have a much better paradigm to explain a lot of what we see. Yes?
Do they have a reason for why just the dinosaurs became extinct?
They're not really saying just the dinosaurs. They're saying the dinosaurs were the dominant species. At the same time, you have insects evolving and birds evolving and so forth. But because dinosaurs were so large and dominant, they have to come up with a way to explain why they're not here without the flood, basically. All right, now the last thing in the story is the origin of man. Now remember, we talked about 3 creative acts in the Genesis account. Why were those important? What were the 3 creative acts? Why did God only create 3 times? Why were there only 3 basic entities that God had to specially create and bring into existence? Why did we stress that in the creation account? Because these are big questions that do not have very good scientific answers. Where did matter come from? What's the response? The Big Bang. And the mathematics involved in it are complicated, so people don't question it. All right, then the next big question. How did life begin? What's the answer? Biochemical roulette in the primordial soup. Over millions and millions of years. And they've tried a lot of experiments trying to duplicate the ideal conditions on the primordial earth and trying to create amino acids in a laboratory. Is that a good model for evolution? No. How did those ideal conditions, what were the ideal conditions? How did they come to be? And here we have professors and scientists in a laboratory repeatedly trying to duplicate the origin of life. That's intelligence directed as well. So evolution has no real answer for the fundamental questions of origins. And what are those 3 fundamental questions of origins? Origin of matter or the universe, the origin of life, and now the third one is the origin of man. Why is man any different than primates? Okay, legally in our country, this is kind of crazy, even comes up in legal matters. Chimpanzees sometimes are used as pets, right? And there are court cases trying to get chimpanzees status as persons. Why, biblically, do chimpanzees not have status as persons? It's crazy. We have 2 things going on. We want to give certain higher animals status as persons, but what do we deny the status as persons? The same court system. What is denied the status of persons? More and more and more and more. Unborn babies. Absolutely. Isn't that crazy? That's the result of the evolutionary paradigm that permeates our country. It's crazy. Okay? And we said that there are 2 results in society. And we're going to spend all second semester dealing with that in the class we call Bio Issues. Why are we having to do this? What did we say were the 2 results in society? No limit to what? Man's depravity. Are we seeing that? Okay. And the other one is loss of what? The sanctity of what kind of life? Human life. So why do we not value human life above animal life? Because it's illogical if you're an evolutionist, right? Because man is no different. So you need to understand that evolution does not have the answer to the fundamental questions of origins. Where did matter come from? How did life begin? And why is man different? And this is the evolutionary story that applies to man. Man's just a higher animal. So according to the origin of man, the journalist that I'm still using his evolutionary story called it branching off. So human evolution is a branch off of some common hominid. See that term, hominid? That's a primitive humanoid. So somewhere, I don't know, about 1 million years or less ago, we have hominids splitting off, these are humanoids, from the great apes. Somewhere around 5 million, 1 million year ago, there were as many as 5 different pre-human or hominid species from the great African apes. And of course, a lot of our supposed human ancestors that we have skeletal fragments for, I'm not going to call them skeletal remains, I'm going to call them skeletal fragments. Why? Piece of a jaw, top of the skull, and so forth. Though we do have a lot of Lucy. If you've seen the reproductions of the bones of Lucy, which is one of our ancestors found in Africa, Lucy is probably much more closer to a chimpanzee. She's a primate. She's some type of ape. Anyways, so the origin of man has all these branching off from the great apes, and then we have a lot of dead ends. An example of a dead end are the Neanderthals. According to evolution, Neanderthals are one of several hominid species that failed to adapt and became extinct. So we have an estimated 5 billion hominids from the time they split from the apes till we finally get to man, and this date is about 10,000 years ago. Oh, have you heard that date before? Well, we do have 10,000 years of biblical history, and I would imagine 10,000 years of traceable human records. So we finally get our Homo sapiens. After we've had hominids that don't survive, we have all these dead ends. Only the Homo sapiens survived around 10,000 years ago. There we go. This, of course, is a creationist rendition. So, once again, evolution does not explain the sanctity of human life. Evolution does not explain why man is separate and distinct from the animal kingdom. That is a Bible doctrine. Okay, so we see we've got Lucy. We're splitting off of the great apes. See the great apes on the top, the hominids? Then we have some dead ends. Neanderthal man, New Guinea man, Cro-Magnon man, and finally, 10,000 years ago, we get modern man. Modern man, biologically speaking, is Homo sapien. Okay? So that's something I want you to pay attention to is modern man, biologically speaking, Homo sapien, survived. After all these trial and error, we finally get our first modern man about 10,000 years ago. So, there we have it, the evolutionary story. And the thing with the evolutionary story is that it's not questioned. Okay? And the evidences that we're going to start going through next week, we're going to go through 2 days lecture. There are 6 evidences. Monday, we will go through the first 3. Next Thursday, we will go through the following 3. So we will have our quiz on Monday. Make sure you go back to the overlaps that I'm stressing at the beginning. I want you to know those 3 foundational questions that evolution does not have an answer for. All right, we'll see you on Monday.